This podcast is for educational purposes only, does not constitute legal advice, and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you need legal assistance about a legal problem, contact an attorney.
Welcome back to Know Your Regulator, the podcast that inspires you to engage. I am your host, Simone Murphy, and today's episode touches something that nearly all of us use every day: social media. How can it put your professional license at risk? We're joined by someone who knows this issue inside and out, Tony Bertolino, managing partner at the Bertolino Law Firm and author of our most recent newsletter article titled Social Media in Your Professional Occupational License. Tony, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Simone. And I'm glad that we're touching on this topic because, it's a topic that requires a good conversation that professionals need to have regarding social media. So I'm really happy that you're presenting such a topic to the public.
Absolutely. It is. It's very, very topical and super important for licensed professionals to not only know of, but completely understand.
Mhm.
So let's start at the top. Social media is more than just daily life, but your article makes it very clear for licensed professionals, it's more than just posts and pics. What's the big picture idea here?
Well, what we've seen over the past decade or so is that licensing boards, really across all professions in Texas, are treating social media conduct the same way they treat in-person professional behavior or even misbehavior. And that means that, these off-the-cuff kind of posts and shared memes and, even comment threads could be interpreted as an unprofessional conduct by a board and could subject a license holder to an investigation for misconduct, especially if this conduct violates privacy rules or ethical guidelines that are created by these licensing agencies.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds very serious and, was not something that people really had to worry about 20, 30
Mhm.
years ago. It's definitely
Right.
changed throughout how technology has evolved.
It
Um,
has.
so it sounds like if someone's just venting or just joking or like you said, sharing a meme, that it can still come back to bite them.
Definitely. One example in the article that I made is an attorney posting about a very difficult client that an attorney had. And even if you don't name names, if someone is reading a post on social media and they can identify who you're referring to, you could be violating that attorney-client confidentiality. In this particular case, it's, of course, an attorney. And, the state bar and certainly the boards, they don't play around with this kind of breach. And, so when making these kinds of posts, confidentiality always needs to be in the back of an attorney's mind.
Yeah, that makes sense. You're saying that, even if this person doesn't personally know that person, if they can put two and two together,
Oh,
that this
yeah.
is who you're talking about, that
Hmm.
can get you in trouble. And, in your article, you mentioned it wasn't just lawyers. You wrote about CPAs, nurses, counselors. Really, every board seems to have their own concerns.
They really do. Again, with the use of social media, it's just you know for certain that these licensing boards are going to create laws around social media and they're recognizing that the use of social media can open up professional misconduct, and
Yeah.
so it's just another avenue. What I mentioned in the article, for instance, is that the Texas Board of Nursing issued a very clear position on this, actually through what's called Statement 15.29 about social media and how that can blur professional boundaries. And nurses in particular are in a very unique position of trust, and that trust can be broken online without even realizing it. For example, nurses who post patient information, of course, it's violation of federal law, even the HIPAA laws, and even vaguely posting this kind of patient information and could get a nurse in very big trouble with the boards. Sharing offensive memes or posting inappropriate photos on social media, those things could easily be flagged by boards, whether it's the Board of Nursing, the Texas Medical Board, or really any licensing agency. It could it could easily be flagged and could subject a license holder to an investigative notice.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can say I can attest to it. I've seen, people whom I'm friends with on social media who are nurses or in a
Mhm.
licensed profession. Um, it seems like they want to show that they're having fun or how great their job is, but they're posting, patient information or,
Mhm.
close to posting patient information in the process of doing that. So, it's, something they need to be very careful about. I want to break down something you said a little bit more. You mentioned boundaries and the Board of Nursing. What does that look like in practice for nurses?
Well, in particular for nurses, according to the Board of Nursing, professional boundaries are the limits that protect the nurse-patient relationship. Basically, nurses have, a lot of power anyway, and patients are in vulnerable positions. And, when these nurses they cross that line, involving emotional, financial, social, or even sexual violations, that could obviously cross those professional boundaries. And the thing about social media is that can sort of blur those lines because the platform itself makes it easy to get too personal too quickly. Nurses are in the job of patient care, and that's it. They're not there to be really close friends with their patients. They're not there to give their patients, money, help a patient out if a patient happens to be struggling financially. It's actually a violation for a nurse to give money to a patient. You can't do that. Obviously emotional and, as I mentioned before, sexual kind of involvement between a patient and a nurse is certainly things that subject you potentially to a violation notice, a letter from the Board of Nursing. So again, social media sort of blurs those lines, but there are laws in place that are used to sort of unblur those lines, if you will,
Yeah.
and could open the door to investigations.
Yeah, and you are so right. It really does. It blurs those lines and it kind of, can I do this? Can I not do this? It's good to know
Right.
that the Board of Nursing has really clear guidelines on that. It from my understanding, it sounds like something like just connecting with a patient on Facebook or responding to them if they, send you a direct message or somehow contact you directly, that kind of crosses that line.
Yeah. That's actually could be a really good example of a potential violation of professional boundaries and crossing those professional boundaries. The Board of Nursing specifically warns against using, privacy settings as a shield. Just because your Facebook page is a friends only doesn't mean you're going to, be protected against those professional boundary laws. It could still be a violation of professional boundaries, which could result in any type of disciplinary action, whether it's a warning to the nurse or perhaps maybe suspension of the nurse license and leading all the way up to revocation of the nursing license. So, it's pretty serious stuff. I mean, you've got to, if you're a nurse, you've got to maintain those professional boundaries. You're not, again, you're there to provide nursing care and that's it.
Yeah, wow. It sounds like a really, really slippery slope that we're talking about. And switching gears a bit, you also mentioned the Texas State Board of Examiners of Professional Counselors. What is their stance on this?
Well, their guidance is really focused on maintaining ethical standards, like most all
Mhm.
licensing agencies. That's their job. But the counseling board in particular, they're emphasizing and telling these counselors first, don't connect with their clients, and that's what they're called, by this type of licensing agency. They're not called patients; they're actually called clients.
Mhm.
They're telling these counselors don't connect with these clients on a personal social media accounts. Just don't do it. Always get informed consent before using social media in any client related way. Avoid disclosing any identifying client information, even indirectly. Again, you've got to maintain confidentiality. Another thing that they're telling counselors is use secure platforms if you're providing services online. You've got to make sure that there's no way that you can get an outsider to go in and breach of the security systems in these platforms and therefore gain access to confidential information. And then, of course, you know, be a good person, be civil, be respectful, be aware
Right.
that what you post could reflect, negatively on you and certainly, reflects on your professional identity.
Yeah. What happens if someone violates those rules?
Well, that's that's when you may be subjected to, disciplinary action or at least an investigation. The board has made it very clear that they will investigate and even sanction license holders, for example, for online sexual misconduct or unprofessional behavior, even making racist or discriminatory comments, and even things like misrepresenting credentials or making inappropriate remarks about clients or patients. Again, what we're talking about is not necessarily, one-on-one misbehavior, but
Hmm.
behavior done on the internet, done on these social media platforms. And these licensing agencies are not going to tolerate it. From their perspective, misbehavior is misbehavior. And if it's in violation of a particular rule or law, and you're unprofessional in your conduct, it's going to open you to being investigated. And so you got to be mindful.
So how do they find out about these posts? Are these, is someone taking a screenshot and sending them in? Or do you know how that happens? How do they see these posts?
The thing, first of all, the posts are made public, of course, and anybody can report a post that they see that they had, that suggests in their minds that there could be unprofessional conduct through these posts, and they can, easily notify the board and let them know. And that's where it gets a lot of license holders in trouble. We tend to vent our frustrations on social media, just generally as people, right?
Right.
And but when you're a licensed professional, you're held to that higher standard. You're granted a license and you're given, certain responsibilities that are not typically given to a normal person who's not licensed, and that can
Right.
post whatever they want. And the board really at any time can go into your social media postings if they're notified about a postings by, anybody, as someone can complain about you about a particular posting, or you happen to be under investigation currently and the board is very interested in seeing what social media postings that you've recently posted. It can really add to the allegations that have already been made against you. For example, if you're accused of drunk driving or drunkenness at work and you're a license holder, and you're impaired at work, and you have a ton of posts of you chugging beer, or you're at a late night after hours party, and
Right.
you're really misbehaving and showing misbehavior in your online posts. Well, that's evidence that can be used against you. The bottom line is misbehavior is misbehavior. And if you've got, sort of a timeline or a history of or a history of drunkenness, and you're being accused of a DWI by a board, well, it just makes sense that they're going to perhaps use that evidence against you and show that you've got a history of this. And it's not just a one-time thing, and that you've been doing it, for many months or perhaps years, depending on how far your posts go and how long ago, they were able to obtain these evidentiary posts, if you will. So, it certainly be damaging to your case. Again, whether you're being investigated or if you're involved in an actual hearing. So you've got to be, you got to be very mindful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point to make. So, what would be your advice for license holders who are active on social media?
I would suggest that, before you post, pause for a minute. You have to understand that your license is part of your livelihood. You rely on your license to, to feed your families and your children and to live and pay your mortgage. It allows you to practice in the area that you work so hard, to obtain to go to school and to obtain a license in. You're in positions of trust. You're not just earning a living from what you're doing, but you're also using your license to serve others. I suggest and advise that you just don't let careless tweets or heated Facebook posts jeopardize what you've done so hard to achieve in your life. Again, be mindful, stay professional, and more importantly, know the boundaries that your board expects you to uphold.
The big one, absolutely. Well, Tony, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and shedding light on this really, really important topic.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Simone. It's always a pleasure to be on.
To our viewers, please remember what you post online isn't just personal, it's professional. If you hold a license, it is your responsibility to stay informed and stay in compliance. You can find Tony's full article in our latest newsletter and check out Know Your Regulator for more resources on staying compliant in your profession. Until next time, stay inspired and continue engaging with your regulatory agency.
Know Your Regulator, the podcast that inspires you to engage.